Hello and welcome to the second video. This is going to be the second part of the verbal, and it's going to be lesson 10. Lesson 11 we're going to be primarily looking at gameplay, but lesson 10 we're going to be looking a little more in depth at what we discussed already in lesson 9, discussing the non-material and the non-physical side of the game. And so, building on from the concept we had discussed earlier about the signifying principles of thinking and feeling within the game, certain questions from that can be arised. And these questions arise through many different facets of how the natural mind usually thinks. And so, although short, today's video will be looking at some of these clouds that we mentioned, these clouds of thought that we talked about yesterday, with the intention to remove all authority, to extinguish them to a point where we can look at the game and no questions surface, and the only thing left is really just understanding and comprehension of nothing more than really a language. And so you may have heard this been tossed around, the concept that League is a language, and well, when this language begins to be read, your role as a player becomes less ambiguous and a lot more established. This feeling of self-establishment, first of all, puts you in a state of ease. And so you're not in this neurotic state of mind all the time when you're playing the game, because you're afraid of, who's going to run it down and what type of alarming situations you might come across in the next few seconds of your gameplay. Because you yourself, you have a goal as well, you have an intention. And so anything that goes in front of that intention tends to surface negative emotions, because now there's these blocks, these factors that are, well, they're denying you from what you want, which would be your goal. Whether that be to take a tower, whether that be to win a lane, whether that be to win the game, ultimately. And so, when this feeling of establishment is realized, the questions that you have begin to evaporate. And so do the current doctrines in your mind. See, the intent is not to give you an idea, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday, but the intention is to completely rid you of the fabrications that you have altogether. And so really we're eradicating without the purpose of building. What could we really build after a total extermination of our current perspectives of the game? And again, when I say these things, I'm talking to the players that are still not at the top of the mountain, the ones that can still look up, the ones that still see ground, the ones that realize that they don't understand the game. And so, just like as we discussed in the previous session, one has to become almost like a phoenix, completely evaporate your current understanding to ultimately become more receptive and soon after build. But that's not what I'm intending on doing. I'm not looking to build, I'm simply looking to destroy, because that would be the first step, really, right? The building really comes from the knowledge parts of the channel, where I'll be talking to you about these handful of concepts that we're just going to really be playing around. Much like a language where, we have different letters, and these letters can be shifted around to make different words, which could be shifted around to give different meanings. And so the baseline principles of a language would still be letters. And so what you have to do with League of Legends is you have to understand the letters before you can begin to understand the language. And so, well, what would be the alternative if you weren't to do what I say in this case, which is a total extermination? You could only really build more garbage upon more garbage after you go through a transition of a clean slate. And so the reason for that is because you only know what you know. And so let's say you destroy your understanding of the game, eradicate all your preconceptions, and then attempt to build something anew, but really it would only be another mirror of incompetency that you would build. Because the building blocks of that would be the fact that you don't know what you don't know. And hence you find coaching, hence you find guidance. But the guidance can only be relevant to you if you have an empty cup of water. So the saying that I'm trying to get to here is you cannot come to a coach, you cannot get guidance with the full cup of water, because there's nothing to fill it with. You already have too many preconceived ideas about the game, and so you have to throw the water out. You have to come in as an empty cup, or you have to come in as an empty slate. But that's very hard to do because the mind is something that clings onto anything possible. And so if you're doing something today and you found a little bit of success, the mind is extremely uncomfortable attempting to drop, because it constitutes whatever it is that I'm telling you to drop as success. And so then, well, success is what you want. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of players, a lot of specifically lower level players, they end up picking these champions, and I would tell them to drop it, and then they would have a very hard time. And so then they would very much use every single fiber in their being to try to fulfill this self-deprived feeling of, I have to play my champion even if it hurts me. And so they have a very hard time coming in as a clean slate. And this is what you have to do as athletes, is you have to come in with an absolutely empty slate of mind. And that's not easy to do, but it's the most effective way, because then when we start talking about the relevancies of what really does matter in the game, you'll be able to pick it up a lot faster. So think of it as a spring cleaning of some sort, really. And so in the initial stages, it's vital to prepare the right landscape. This landscape is to efficiently run thoughts of relevance. And the first step to this really mental reconditioning is to remove all will. And this is a very difficult thing to do. Let's substitute your feeling of will. Well, what is will? Will is really, I will do something. Will is really your need to push in a certain direction that you deem as most beneficial for you. However you may get to that conclusion in your own minds. Everyone tends to think differently, of course. although very alike in the same, in a different context. Because although the thoughts are very different, the principles of thought are very much alike. And so this is what I'm trying to explain to you here, is not understanding thought itself, but the principles of thought, and then completely extinguishing those to, well, be able to be receptive. And so the goal is really to become receptive. And so why removing all will to control the outcome of your matches is because wanting to win your matches and being afraid of losing your matches is not a thought that holds any relevance to you in order to win the game. In fact, it's clutter, and as we discussed, quantity is not something that we will attempt to remedy with more quantity. And so the very thought of you wanting to win and the very thought of you being afraid to lose is a hindrance to your own success, because it counts as clutter. And so you can look at this from the perspective of desire. Even when you want to, even if you don't want to desire something and you want to become desireless, that in itself is still, in a way, a desire. Likewise, that is still a thought. And in the context of League of Legends, this thought of will, this wanting to win, this wanting to lose, is more of a feeling rather than a thought. And when it's a feeling, then you do everything in your fiber as a human being to try to win the game, of course, but the goal is not a cloud that arises. It's not a cloud of thought. Of course, it's in the aftermath in some subtle way, because everything you do in the game is to, of course, win it. And so one cannot play without the awareness of wanting to win. And so that is a desire. But it's a very different thing to say that wanting to win and thinking about winning are two very different things. Because as we discussed, in the context of relevant thought within the game, wanting to win will cause thoughts that gain, well, they serve you no purpose. You're thinking about many things in the game. Well, not really many, a very few handful, but for the sake of the argument, I'll say that there's many. Of course, to an untrained player, even juggling two concepts is a challenge in the beginning. And so that could be seen as many. However, to an experienced player, that could be seen as a very natural thing. But regardless, there is still a quantity of variables. And when you start thinking about winning, that's a problem. In fact, there was a saying, I don't entirely recall it, so forgive me, but the saying went something alike as, when you have one eye on the goal and one eye on the road, you're not really looking straight. You're going to fall somewhere, because your one eye is constantly on the goal. And you only have two eyes. Likewise, when it comes to your thought, which we discussed is really nothing more than energy in the last lesson, is very limited, and you have to allocate it to the right relevancies of the game. And so I say it again, remove all will to win and remove all will to lose. Remove all desire to climb. And only have the desire to be aware of the coaches or the players or whatever streams of educational content you're absorbing to completely embody your state of mind, or your state of understanding, or we can call it your state of consciousness, even. And of course, this is a very difficult thing to do. It's not easy. And of course, we'll talk about methods, right? Because this is a very realistic approach we're attempting to take to really engineer the non-physical side of the game, which is very difficult to do. Much more difficult than to engineer yourself as a player that can find competency within the physical side of the game, because, well, repeating something over and over again will, of course, make you better. But for you to truly thrive, you have to be aware and comprehensive to, well, the reality. And so we ask ourselves, well, where does this will come from? Where does this desire to win come from? And it's a very fundamental and very important thing, because if you have no desire to win, then, well, how will you compete? It's not possible. So in some way, it's a paradox. In some way, I'm telling you that you need to remove all will, and at the same time, without will, you will never play the game. And so it sounds rather contradictory. But under the context of thinking, and under the context of relevant thought, any desire to win can remain a desire, but once it becomes a thought, will be nothing more than a hindrance to you as a player. And so now we can look even deeper into this, and we ask ourselves, well, where does this desire become a thought, and why does this desire become a thought? And who exactly is it that's making this desire a thought? Because again, it is the thought that we're trying to extinguish. And so then eventually we come to the realization that it's actually our ego. And, well, being aware of one's ego in a constant is nothing short of a tightrope walker. Because our minds will do everything to protect the ego. And so sometimes this mind will even fabricate reality, and hence why Dunning-Kruger exists. But the core of this is ego. The will to win is not wrong. It's very fundamental and important to have. But once that will becomes a thought, within the game it's a hindrance. And that thought comes from nothing more than ego, which is a fabrication of oneself. It's a mask. It's a personality or a persona, which personality comes from the word persona, which I don't remember whether it was Greek or Latin, but it was under the context of having a mask, in which an actor would put on a mask, and these masks would, they would be rotated among all the actors. And so you would wear a mask, but it would be really illogical to say that you are the mask. And likewise, that's exactly what we do with ego. We're like the actors who can't give up their masks. And so because this is the case, ego consistently gives you an illusion, because ego is security, really. And, well, the mind is by nature a very cowardly, I guess we could call it, entity within us, because it's constantly looking to find security, right? Whether that is in the context of, getting married and not being alone or something, because people have that fear. or in the context of never hitting a certain rank, which you believe you deserve. And perhaps even your friends tell you that you deserve it. But really all of that comes from the ego, and really it's nothing more than a fabrication. A fabrication that creates thought which hinders reality. Because now again, you're a knowledgeable fool. You're trying to beat quantity with more quantity. So my approach is completely different. My approach is the opposite of that, which is to extinguish all thought, become aware of the ego. Likewise, with the same methods we discussed yesterday, and become more receptive. Now again, it's a paradox because ego is very important, because without ego, well, it's going to be very hard to function in modern society. It's going to be very hard to function even within a team environment inside of League. And so you have to, in some cases, have a mask on. That's what a lot of streamers do. I did that for a very long time. And the mask serves utility because the masks allow you to personify a message to different types of people, and perhaps that allow you to attain a certain goal. So in my case, I took an authoritative figure or a very authoritative perspective, of course with some arrogance, but only for a utilitarian reason. But again, just like everyone, these masks can be stuck to people. And so these are essentially actors that don't want to give up their mask. And again, this is very crucial to understand because the esports athlete has to be receptive. And the mind will do everything to personify illusions, much like you would be at, perhaps if, oh, God forbid, you're stranded in a desert and you look into the distance and you start fabricating an oasis. Or perhaps you're stranded in the middle of the ocean and you start fabricating land. Because likewise, our minds will create whatever we want. And a lot of what we want stems from the ego. Therefore, we are essentially walking in a giant rain cloud of illusion, really. And then when reality says otherwise, when you don't attain the rank you want, when the coach tells you you're not good, when your fabrications begin to be challenged with the context of reality, now you do everything to fight. You go into this flight or fight mode, or fight and flight mode, I think is what it's termed. And then you slowly realize that you begin to revolt. And so, likewise, giving up all will and simply surrendering to the reality is the way to really rid yourself of these fabrications that you yourself have created as a player. And so, when you do this, you begin to truly observe the outcomes of your situations, and without judgment, whichever rank or skill variance you are within the ladder, you simply surrender to the outcome without any fighting, and then you begin to grow. You quickly begin to realize that These are all just affirmations of your ego, where you expect an outcome. And then when reality says no, you use every fiber in your own being to repress this rather accusatory, personal rejection, really, that life is throwing at you. And see, I'm not telling you to be desireless. And so what I want you to do is become absolutely aware of both the emotions of loss and victory, but don't lean towards one. Of course, everything we do is to win the game. But when loss happens, don't identify yourself. And when victory happens, don't identify yourself with that either. And so, for the scientists, you can just ask, well, does my will to control the outcome of the game hold any relevance while I'm playing the game? And you'll quickly realize that there really is no usefulness for your will in terms of when it becomes a thought. And so when you realize this, you also end up realizing that your entire goal was on the destination and not the method. But it's the method that's important. The destination is irrelevant. Winning the game and losing the game has nothing to do with the game itself. Because when you're thinking about winning or losing, you're thinking about the destination and you're forgetting about the method, the methods that actually get to you, to get you to a positive destination. And so the destination is really irrelevant. It's very far away. And so the question is, why are we thinking about winning and losing while we're laning? And when you do this, you become a very active mind. You become a knowledgeable fool. And now you begin to, again, value quantity over relevance. And so this idea of awareness is in itself not a philosophy. Rather, it's a method. Because philosophies are very pointless, really. The most neurotic people are usually philosophers. And then there's also the psychotherapists. They're usually the most erratic type of people I've met. And so really it's a game of the blind leading the blind in that way as well. But really this is a method. And this is a method of self-awareness. And really it's a trial and error science experiment. Nothing short of what any alchemist or scientist would attempt to do. And this follows nothing but logic. And so there was this there's this old Buddhist teaching. I don't remember exactly how. I know what I understand the message, but I don't exactly remember how he told the story. But it basically went like, if you like something, don't pull it. Don't pull it towards you. And likewise, if you dislike something, don't push it away from you. Because that's what the human mind tends to do. Again, ego. When ego is damaged because the reality's outcome, or the outcome of reality, and we don't like it, we tend to push it away. And likewise, when the reality meets our criteria, well, then we begin to pull it towards us. And so again, if you like something, don't pull it. And likewise, if you dislike something, don't push it away. And so what you begin to realize by doing this is that you're in a very equilibrium state of mind. You can call this as Tao, you can call this Zen, you can call this flow, whatever you want. And this equilibrium is not accidental. This flow is not accidental. Rather, it's a very formulated flow through self-realization. And so eventually you realize by doing this that the questions that you've had about the game, they begin to evaporate. And then you come to a point in the game where now you have no questions. You only watch the game and you simply are aware of the things happening. And then, well, all of a sudden, you see the game differently. The pieces of the puzzle, they interconnect in a very methodical, very fluid-like manner. Everything makes sense in question. There simply are no more questions. See, when you ask a question, in order to receive the answer, you assume that the answer would clear up the question. But you never actually question the question itself, and that's why, well, this is one of the reasons I stopped streaming, actually. Because players would have questions. And I didn't mind answering questions. I really enjoy answering questions, actually. So I'm always open for DMs if you have any questions, right? But when you never question the question itself, then the question loses value. And so the answer loses value. When you question the question itself, so when you do the alternative, you're essentially questioning your own understanding, and you begin to look at the game from angles otherwise you may not have discovered. And you realize that you actually know nothing, and therefore you surrender to the outcome. And this is the most natural way to do things. This is how you become more receptive. When you realize you know nothing, your ego evaporates. You know, there's an unknown disease within the League of Legends community, and I call it the coach syndrome, is when individuals get promoted to the positions of a coach, and we use that term very lightly. The coach begins to develop an ego because he has to know what he's talking about. And so this ego then eventually, well, just look at any other coach. You'll see how they have to be correct in what they're saying. Otherwise, their own image of themselves as coaches begins to deteriorate, not within just the eyes of the students, but also the eyes of the coach themselves, because again, their own ego tells them that they're correct. Again, nothing more than a cloud of fabrication, of illusion. The coach is stranded in a desert and he sees the oasis, and he keeps leading people to the oasis, not knowing that it's nothing more than just an illusion. And when he does that, really all he's doing is throwing people under the bus, really. So when ego evaporates, you begin to see the reality of the game for what it is. And this is a very silent inner transaction, which requires more awareness than focus, really. And focus and awareness are two very different phenomenons. And so, well, what is focus? And so focus, on one hand, it narrows down. It blurs the rest of the picture in our peripheries, and it causes us to be tense. And so focus causes tension. Tension does not allow you to be aware. And so what awareness, on the other hand, is a much more restful state for a League player. See, when you're focused, you may not be receptive, but when you're aware, your natural state of mind is to be receptive. And awareness allows you to absorb a much larger picture without maintaining a constant perspective, a narrow perspective, a blurred perspective. And so, of course, there is a microtransaction between focus and awareness. When you're learning something, it's very important to focus on it. And likewise, when you were first learning how to drive, you have to be a little focused, because every little detail matters until eventually It's very easy, and then all it requires you to be is simply aware. You don't have to be focused. You don't have to focus on everything. Simply be aware, and driving becomes the most natural thing possible. Just like breathing, really. Of course, we'll go a little more into detail with this. This video is more really detailed towards the ego of a player, but we'll talk about the idea of focus and attention and awareness later, as we'll do more verbals within the next 90 or so lessons, right? And so, with that being said, let's just summarize everything. So, remove all will to control the outcome of your matches. Surrender to the reality, which is, whatever that reality may be, without judgment, without prejudice, and if that judgment still exists in some subtle way within you as a person, then it will pass over time by you simply being aware of it. By removing all will, you remove all questions and opinions. Therefore, what remains is the thought of relevance, which you will learn from absorbing quality content on the game. We will talk about the relevant thoughts throughout the next 90 lessons, so you don't have to worry. I'm not leaving you stranded in the middle of the ocean, pointing to land here. Thought is... So, throughout this process, you will be reminded of your ego as you go throughout your improvement journey, okay? This realization will make you less of a knowledgeable fool and more of a receptive individual to the reality of things. Every process we discuss on the channel will follow a basis of absolute logic, both in terms of in-game and the non-physical side of the game. And if something is not logical, then it should not be done. Okay? So, that's it for this video. I will be preparing some gameplay this week for us to look at. And for now, I would highly advise the viewers to simply just be aware of the few things, the few topics of discussion that we've talked about over the past 2 videos. And of course, if you have any questions, you can always message me on Discord while I'm still, as I said, a participant of the League of Legends community within these next 90 or so lessons. Okay? Anyways, that is it for this verbal. The next video will be some gameplay stuff, and so I will see you then. Take care.